Now we're going to be covering sustainability, which has really been the focus and kind of the passion of my work in implementation science. So where does sustainability fit in? So we've learned a lot through the various modules about different phases of implementation science. And as we talked about, we're trying to do more about ways we can think about embedding implementation science into our work when we're first developing or testing evidence-based interventions, as opposed to waiting till we develop all these programs and then study implementation. But as you can see here, when we think about kind of the translational pipeline, sustainment is really at the end there. And the truth is, even with an implementation science, sustainment gets understudied. It often gets, kind of thrown in, but no one actually gets to it. And the focus of implementation science has mostly been on this implementation phase. So it's been highly understudied. When we think about the Proctor framework that we've talked about, sustainability is listed as one of many potential implementation outcomes. So again, it's kind of tucked in there as one possible construct we might measure. And then we maybe have seen it a little bit in some of our frameworks. Again, REAIM has us think about maintenance, but again, often that's measured more at the 6-month point as opposed to longer term sustainability. And the EPIS framework by Greg Ahrens also has a specific phase kind of thinking about what factors might matter specifically for sustainment. But again, a lot of the focus of the field has been on earlier implementation. So my work and the work of my colleagues, we've tried to make the case that if we really want to advance work on sustainability in particular, we need to think about sustainability as its own kind of phase or domain within implementation science. And we can't kind of tuck it in as we have been and try and understand it while we're trying to understand implementation. So we've kind of made that case in our work. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from an annual review of public health article that I did with some of my colleagues, Brittany Cooper and Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman. So anything you hear about, this would be a good reference for that. So what do we mean when we talk about sustainability? So Mary Ann Shire was really a pioneer in the field. She did her dissertation in the 80s on sustainability. She was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation program officer and, again, really a pioneer in the field. And she kind of put it forth as, understanding the continued use of the program at kind of sufficient intensity to still be able to achieve whatever kind of health behavior outcomes or population outcomes that you're interested in and that you're focused on. And in our work, we've kind of put this forth as being, multidimensional, that sustainability is really about, does the program continue to be delivered? And really trying to understand, again, if you have 6 components of that program, are they all delivered over time? And to what extent are they adapted and how are they adapted? Does the program continue to deliver the health benefits and health outcomes that it originally had in the kind of original evidence-based efficacy or effectiveness trials? And is whatever capacity or whatever partnerships or networks that were in place that were needed to be developed to implement the intervention, are they still maintained over time? I think historically when people thought about sustainability, they thought about it just as institutionalization, so kind of the extent to which a program was written into a budget line item or kind of written in terms of like someone's role being developed to kind of reflect the program continuation. And a lot of this came out of the school-based literature in kind of the early 90s. And I think there's been a move away from thinking about sustainability as being synonymous with sustainability, and a move away from thinking about sustainability as something that's static and more up towards something that's dynamic. And I think that's because there is this recognition that, the contexts in which we work are dynamic and changing. The evidence base is shifting. So I do a lot of work in cancer screening, and over the past 25 years, we've had multiple changes in terms of what the recommendations are, what's recommended, how often, et cetera. So recognizing that kind of having a static approach to thinking about sustainability of programs isn't really appropriate. So understanding their dynamic sustainability over time. we've seen kind of an evolvement of the definition. So this is from Moore and colleagues in Canada. So again, they get at this idea that sustainability is really about understanding continued delivery of the program and its impact over time, but it also gets at this idea that the program may evolve or adapt. And it really gets at this idea that it's not only the intervention that you might be studying over time, but also potentially the implementation strategies, whether or not they continue to be delivered. So why is sustainability important? So no matter what health issue, no matter the setting, no matter the population you're working with, sustainability is commonly one of the biggest challenges that we hear across the board. So again, Marianne Shire was a Robert Wood Johnson program officer, and in her portfolio, what she did and published on was that she went and looked at health programs that had been funded, health promotion programs, and she went back and said, okay, what's the extent to which they're still in place, at least one component, 1 to 6 years after their adoption. And she found that only about 40 to 60% continued at all. And again, most of them were continuing at kind of a lower level of delivery. Again, this is also a huge issue in terms of accountability. So funders, again, are often providing huge investments in terms of having people develop and deliver evidence-based interventions, but we're not necessarily seeing the impact in terms of their impact on disparities or on population health. And I think part of this is because they're not necessarily sustained. And this has huge implications for partnerships, community partnerships. So when I think about trust with my partnerships and my ability to maintain partnerships, if I were to deliver an intervention and then we work on do all this work on getting it implemented, and then after a year, if it falls apart or the researcher walks away, that has huge implications in terms of future partnerships and kind of the erosion of trust and the investment and just relationship. So I think that's another really critical reason why we need to understand sustainability. And Enola Proctor, who's been a leader in the field, really identified this as one of the most significant translational issues we're facing. And just to note, a lot of work has been focused on individual level sustaining behavior change. So this was a great piece that came out this year on what we know about this. But again, we're often talking at the community or organizational level. How do we sustain programs which will impact, again, ideally, population health and health disparities? So some of the challenges with doing the work on sustainability. So a lot of the work has been very descriptive, often at single sites, rarely guided by frameworks. People have variable definitions historically of sustainability. So some people might say, we're going to measure this at 6 months. Some people might say 3 years. Some people might be looking at the program impact. Some might be looking at the program delivery. Think about if you were asked to represent a program, you as one individual representing whether or not a program is sustained, and you're asked kind of yes, no. So think about how well that actually reflects sustainability. If it's dichotomous, if it's self-report, there's issues around social desirability. And if you say, yes, the program's sustained, what does that actually mean? Is all of it sustained? Part of it doesn't tell you anything about adaptation. Often our follow-up has been very short-term, and it's rarely been prospective. It's often retrospective. Again, Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman's done some great work in this area. And again, as I mentioned earlier, she's looked at 125 studies of sustainability and found that most of these studies, only about a quarter, report health behaviors and outcomes, the continued impact on them. So we know little about sustainability of health behaviors and health outcomes. Less than half the programs that do continue, most don't continue at high fidelity. And only about half of the programs are even continuing to measure continued delivery of the various program components. And this is kind of what got her into this whole area of adaptation, is that when people report on sustainability, people often are not including information about whether programs are being adapted over time, which components are in place, what's being adapted and why, and what's the health impact of those partially sustained programs. So these have been huge gaps. David Chambers leads the implementation science group at the National Cancer Institute. and he's done some really foundational work on sustainability. So he proposed the dynamic sustainability framework. And I think, again, this just reflects this concept that sustainability is not static, that when we're trying to understand sustainability, it's really this idea of focusing on kind of continued learning and evaluation over time and ongoing adaptations to enhance kind of their fit with different populations, with changes in the evidence base, and with changing in context. So again, this idea of dynamic, not static sustainability. What factors actually influence sustainability? So a lot of my work has started to capture some of this. So we often, I think there's been kind of this idea that funding is all that's important for sustainability, but actually a lot of the research suggests that funding is, of course, very important, but there's other factors that matter. So just like we talked about the various levels of the consolidated framework for implementation research, policy factors, organizational factors, characteristics of the populations and implementers, and characteristics of the intervention itself and how well it fits also matter for sustainability, as we'll discuss. There's also a whole group of people who have started to think about how do we proactively plan for sustainability. So in the UK, particularly in more clinical settings, they've proposed the NHS Sustainability Modeling Guide, which you can read about. They kind of lead you through that process. A lot of people have used community-based participatory research to help plan for sustainability. And then there's a lot of health promotion program planning models like Precede Proceed or intervention mapping that have you think about and plan for sustainability in advance. So particularly for people who might be developing interventions from scratch, there are ways to think about sustainability from the beginning. And from an implementation science lens, so Doug Luke's group at Washington University has done some great work in this area, particularly focusing on community settings and public health settings. So they've done a lot of work in health departments and other types of community organizations. And they've developed the Program Sustainability Assessment Tool, or the PSAT. If you go to sustaintool.org, they have amazing resources. So this is both an evaluation tool where you can kind of measure and think about various factors that might matter for sustainability. They're still doing some work on kind of the validation of that. But you can also use it as a planning tool. So I have used this with my own partners, and you can think about identifying as a site or as a group or as individuals what factors you think would be important to try and prioritize. And that would be meaningful and that might be gaps as you think about planning for sustainability. And then on the website, they actually link with some resources and tools for thinking about addressing those. So I think this is a great resource for the field, and I've definitely used this with my partners.